Let's open up to Hebrews chapter 11 together again this morning. Hebrews 11, we'll be considering verses 17 to 22 together. A crucible is a container designed to withstand extreme heat. So in metal refining, for example, gold, silver, or copper is heated in a crucible until it melts. And that can take a great deal of heat for that to occur. And then sometimes that heat needs to stay be applied for a long time. And as that's going on with metal, the impurities are rising to the surface. And the results, after they come to the surface, they can be removed, and then you end up with a purer metal. In that instance, the crucible is not meant to destroy whatever's inside of it, but rather to remove what doesn't belong. Crucibles, though, are not just for metal. They're not just for science experiments or that sort of thing. They're also for faith. You cannot go through the Christian life without your faith being tested, and the crucibles for faith are many. There are all kinds of crucibles that your faith could end up being tested by. 1 Peter 1 verse 7 speaks of your faith more precious than gold. Apparently it's very, very precious. And it mentions it being tested by fire. The Bible's clear that your faith will be tested, and it's not really a matter of if, but when, and not just a matter of once, but probably again and again and again, all throughout your Christian life. The recipients of Hebrews were living at a time where they were basically in a spiritual crucible, and the heat was being turned up and applied to their faith as it may be to yours right now. And Hebrews 11 was meant to encourage them. It's also meant to encourage you and stimulate your faith. And so I want to start by asking you, what crucible are you in right now? Is your faith in right now? And that crucible could be relational of some kind. It could be financial, spiritual, physical, emotional. It could be all of the above, all at once, and more. Hebrews 11, 17 to 22 will help you through all of life's crucible moments. And Abraham will see models for you how faith behaves in one single, intense, terrifying moment, while Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph show you that faith endures over a whole entire lifetime of crucible moments like that. And the combined effect conveys that faith is proven not only in moments of great crisis like what we'll see with Abraham, but actually over an entire lifetime of confident obedience to God's promises. God has spoken, and I believe, and I'm going to obey. True faith is unbreakable and indestructible. In fact, I think we could go so far as to say that true faith is as indestructible as the indestructible life of our resurrected Lord. You remember in chapter 7, verse 16, that Jesus' life, he's talked about as having life that is indestructible. And so consequently, our faith becomes just as indestructible as the resurrected life of Jesus because it's tied directly to it. If your faith is real, it should stand through testing. And that's what we see here in Hebrews 11, and especially in these verses this morning. If you want to look at verses 17, I will read down through verse 22. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave direction concerning his bones. From these verses, we're going to note two crucibles of faith. The first one, your faith should stand the test of turmoil. That's the first crucible. A faith that cannot endure crisis is not genuine faith at all. When God gives a person faith at salvation, he actually equips that person to sail, we could say, the high seas of life with him as their captain. Great storms will rise up and threaten to swamp out and drown and crush your faith. In fact, if you were watching the ship from the shore, so to speak, with binoculars, and you're watching the ship of faith sail out on these wavy, crashing seas, there might be moments where you're looking out and it looks as if this ship has been overtaken by the waves and it's actually disappeared. You can't even see it anymore. But then suddenly you see that ship back on the surface and it's cresting and crashing over the waves again. There it is. And that's what faith does. It sails through the crashing waves of crisis. Unbreakable faith does not mean a faith that is unshakable. There will be moments in your life that it looks like your faith, or your life or another Christian's life, where it looks like your faith has been drowned by the waves, it's gone under. But God keeps bringing it back to the surface. It can't be extinguished. It can't be snuffed out. Your faith should stand the test of turmoil. But what might surprise you as we look at this text is that God tests your faith through turmoil. God himself will do that. Look back at verse 17 with Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Who tested Abraham? It was God. And God is going to do the same thing for you. He's going to test you by means of crisis moments where he turns up the heat really, 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 really hot. On your kitchen stove, you've got knobs that ignite and turn on the burners. If you have a gas stove, you'll turn one of those knobs and you'll hear that click, 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 and then the flame whoosh, shoots up. And maybe you could think of God almost as if he has his hands on knobs like that. Knobs of turmoil and testing, and it's God who actually turns them and ignites them and turns the flame on. And also it controls the intensity and duration of the heat. In this text, we see God with his hands on two knobs. And the first knob, we could call it the turmoil of a seemingly contradictory God. Sometimes God doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes God is confusing to us, and he puts us in situations where we're looking around and we're experiencing things and we're wondering where his wonderful promises to us and his clear commands, how those work together. How could God make so many wonderful promises to us and then turn around and give us commands that seem to collide with those promises and contradict? They don't line up. And that's what Abraham was dealing with. God wasn't making any sense. Because on the one hand, Abraham had God's promise. You see it there in verse 18. Through Isaac shall your offspring be named. God made promises to Abraham. He said, Abraham, I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you descendants. And I'm going to bless you. And ultimately that would come through Jesus Christ. But as God made that promise to Abraham, or all those promises, he made it very clear that that was all going to flow through Isaac. That was God's promise. Through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Promise on the one hand, and then God's command on the other. Genesis 22, where the account that's mentioned here in Hebrews 11 took place, Genesis 22, 1-2 says this: After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that math doesn't work. You can't put God's promise there and God's command there and it magically works. God's promise plus God's command, what would that equal? Well, that would equal a dead son and a dead promise, a broken promise. And maybe you are feeling the turmoil of a seemingly contradictory God in your situation right now, and you are looking at the things that God has said to you, the promises that he's made, and the commands that he's giving you, and you're saying, God, you're not making any sense. God promised that he loves you, but he put you in a situation where it doesn't feel like God loves you at all. He's asking you, even demanding things of you, like he wants you to go through something like cancer or some disease or some major health crisis. How does God's promise and God's command and what he wants of my life, how does that all work together? Or God's promised you his grace to help you in time of need, and you sit there and you go, well, I feel super exhausted and I feel tired and worn out. And when is God going to do something? He just keeps leaving me in this scenario. Work just got crazier, home just got crazier, church just got crazier, everything just got crazier. Where is this God that loves you so much and promised his help? But there's another knob that God seems to have his hand on, and that's the turmoil of irreversible obedience. One of the ways that God will test you is throughout your life, God is going to force you to make decisions, as he did with Abraham. And in those moments, you're wrestling with the question, well, am I going to obey God or am I not going to obey God? Will you put it all on the line or will you not? I mean, God will call you to these moments of decision where so much is hanging on the line. God is asking Abraham to do something that is extremely uncomfortable and costly. and that's to kill his own son. And that's not just an uncomfortable decision from Abraham's perspective. I mean, many of us grew up hearing this story from the time we were little kids, and maybe we lose some of its punch. This is distasteful. This is absurd. It's painful. If Abraham obeys God, what he does will be irreversible. He's not going to have his son anymore. God is going to call you to make difficult decisions sometimes, and maybe you're feeling the turmoil of that and the irreversible obedience and what will happen if you choose to go some route with God. Maybe it's a decision pertaining to accepting or not accepting a position at work, or helping your aging parents, or telling your little or even adult child no about something. Well, what if living by faith means that you have to make hard decisions that seem to have these huge consequences, irreversible consequences that you may not feel comfortable with? God's going to put you in situations like that again and again and again, where he's going to bring you right up to the decision point. He's going to tell you, you've got to decide. You're either going to obey me and walk by faith, or you're going to disobey me, regardless of how it feels or how I seem to be to you in the moment. God tests your faith through turmoil, but thankfully that's not the only thing God does. He doesn't stop there. He also sustains your faith through turmoil, and that's what we see with Abraham. God helped him walk by faith through this crisis moment, and God will help you too. You know, God will always help you obey. Look at verse 17 again, and I want you to look at this verse and try to imagine that you don't know the rest of the story. You don't have Genesis 22, and you don't know how this story ends. You're just reading what we read here in Hebrews, verse 17, where God called Abraham to go offer his son as a burnt offering. What do you know just from verse 17 here in Hebrews 11? By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. You would read this verse in Hebrews if you don't have Genesis 22, and you would conclude, well, Isaac's dead. Abraham did the thing. He took his son up on the mountain and he offered him as a burnt offering to the Lord. The verb offered here is in the past tense or perfect tense. It's signifying completed action. It's done. It happened. One person observed this means this past tense verb, that the sacrifice actually took place as far as Abraham's resolve and obedience were concerned. The text here has Abraham with his knife raised above his son. In his heart, he's done it. If you look at verses 17 again, we read that by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act, his knife is raised, of offering up his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. All the promises flow through this boy. Abraham's obedience to the Lord was also immediate and without delay. Once he received God's instructions, Genesis 22 verse 3 tells us that Abraham rose up early in the morning and he went out to do it, to follow the Lord's instructions. Abraham's a man, he doesn't have a backup plan. He doesn't know how this is all going to play out. He's not sitting there negotiating with God, saying, well, God, you said this, and so I've got this other idea of how this could work out. He's not delaying. But what's interesting, faith isn't always this picture of robust strength. I mean, we see Abraham obeying here. But is faith always just this super confident, no questions in the back of your mind, just strength moving forward? No, it's sometimes trembling obedience that keeps moving forward anyway. Shaking and trembling, but God, you spoke, and so here we go. God will help you obey like that, and God will help you do the math. Remember, the math doesn't work here for Abraham on the human level. So why does Abraham go up this mountain and raise his knife? He's going to offer his son as a sacrifice. Well, verse 19 answers that question with great clarity. Look at verse 19. Here's Abraham doing the math. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, that's Isaac, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. In his heart, Abraham had already offered his son to the Lord. Before Abraham headed up the mountain with his son to offer him as a sacrifice to the Lord, he had brought some servants with him, and they stop, and Abraham and his son are about to head up the mountain. And here's what Abraham says to his servants in Genesis 22, verse 5. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. He said, we'll go over there, we'll worship, and then Isaac and I are going to come back. And the story, as you know, ends with God providing a ram in a thicket to be offered in the place of Isaac. But Abraham's doing math. And when faith does math, there are always two parts on the front end of the equation. What are those? Well, one component is God's integrity. And the second component is God's ability. And that's what Abraham has in his equation. Abraham believes that God is a man of his word, integrity, with infinite ability. And we're being asked, well, do you believe that? And so here's how that math equation works. God's integrity plus God's ability equals a God that I can always trust and I can always obey no matter what I can make sense of and can't make sense of. If your faith is real, it should stand the test of turmoil, and that's what we see in this chapter with Abraham. You're going to find yourself in crucibles all throughout your life. And I think God would encourage you, don't waste that heat. God's going to turn the knob, and the flames are going to come, and the heat's going to be applied. Don't waste the heat. As you look at whatever crucible you're in, what is God trying to remove from your heart and your life and thinking right now? What impurities is God seeking to bring to the surface? What's God exposing in your heart and your attitude and your life and your values and what you're living for and everything else? God's turning up the heat to bring all that to the surface so he can take it away. And you want to resist the urge to escape the crucible at all costs. When life gets uncomfortable and the heat gets turned up, you and I think, how do I get out of this? How can I make it go away? How can I make it stop? The sooner this ends, the better. But who's the one who turns that knob and controls the heat and duration that it's on? It's the Lord himself. Do you want to just escape God's good plan for you? And when you're confused and you're looking at it, you can't make sense. God, why this? Why now? Why for so long? Why won't it stop? God, this is confusing. When you're confused, what do we learn from this account? Well, keep obeying what is clear. A lot's going to be unclear. But you can keep obeying what's clear. God, what do you want from me today? You want me in your word. You want me to walk with you. You want me to love you. You want me to serve you. You want me to love the people around me. You want me to live my days for eternity, no matter what's going on. If verses 17 to 19 gave us a man who lived by faith in great crisis, the following verses 20 to 22, give us men, multiple individuals, who lived through any number of crises, a whole lifetime of crises. And they actually, after living through all those crises, they end up coming out on the other side of that with even greater faith. And we could say they come out on the other side with enduring faith, which Hebrews has made so much of. And so our second crucible of faith, your faith should stand the test of time. Verse 13, if you look back up there, talking about various individuals in Hebrews 11, we read that these all died in faith. So we're coming to the point of their deathbed moments. They make it all the way to the end, and they die in faith. Not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And now, verses 20 to 22 actually give us three examples of that very thing. Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who died in faith like that. Look at verses 20 to 22. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. These guys are they're all really old by this point, and they're all about to die when what these verses are talking about here. If the writer of Hebrews is looking for examples of living by faith when life gets hard, I mean, he could take these three guys and he's just got examples coming out his ears of that reality in the lives of these men. I mean, Joseph in particular. But oddly enough, the writer of Hebrews he chooses these examples of like these super lackluster moments in the lives of these men right before they died, and all they're doing is talking to their kids. Think about the material, though, that the writer of Hebrews could have drawn from. I mean, he starts with Isaac. I mean, we just read an account where Isaac's dad almost killed him. I mean, who can tell that story? Yeah, my dad had me laid out, sprawled out there, and had a knife above my head. Like, this is crazy. His brother Ishmael made fun of him. His parents were ancient. His wife deceived him. His son deceived him. You move on to Jacob. I mean, this is a man who knew pain and all forms of loss and trouble and turmoil. He had an extremely difficult father-in-law in Laban. He had a brother who wanted to kill him. I mean, they're living super far apart because of that dynamic. He buried the love of his life, Rachel, prematurely. He had all kinds of difficulties surrounding his kids. You remember that one of his sons slept with one of his wives? One of his daughters was raped. Can you imagine going through that as a parent? Two of his sons murdered an entire community. He buries Joseph. I mean, just think about some of the things that the Bible aren't telling us the whole story on, but what would have happened? Jacob would have had a funeral for his son whose body was never accounted for. Joseph's just dead. And so now they're mourning and they're having a funeral. There is no body. Nobody really knows what happened. Have you ever been at a funeral where parents were burying their teenage or young adult child? I have. I mean, in those moments, you're just struck by the fact it's not supposed to be like this, right? Like, parents shouldn't be burying their kids. Kids bury their parents. He lived through famine. And I'm piling all these up because Hebrews wants you to feel the weight of a lifetime of testing, and we haven't even got to Joseph. His story is one of perpetual tragedy. He loses his mother at a young age. His mom is gone. He's thrown into a pit by his brothers and left for dead. They all hated him, hated his guts. He's sold as a slave by his own family. He finally gets hauled off to Egypt and ends up, it seems like maybe things have taken kind of a positive turn, and now he's a servant, a slave in Potiphar's house, and next thing he knows is he's being falsely accused of raping Potiphar's wife. Then consequently, he ends up thrown in an Egyptian prison. He's forgotten about and left to rot there. I mean, it's around every corner. It's bad turn, bad turn, bad turn, bad turn. And yet Joseph he keeps trusting God, and it's all been negative. Again, if the writer of Hebrews is looking for examples of faith in the lives of these men in crucible moments, there is no shortage of that kind of material to choose from. But what's more remarkable than any of those moments is that these men, having lived through them, came out on the other side. Their faith was tested in the crucible, and they stand all the way to the end. And that's what verses 20 to 22 record for us in rather undramatic fashion. You read through Hebrews 11, and you're like, why is that there? These guys are dying and blessing their sons. But this is what the writer of Hebrews has placed such great emphasis on, a faith that goes all through life and it endures all the way to the end. There are many stories of Allied bomber planes returning home from missions over Europe that didn't look like they should be flying, right? I mean, these planes would come land and you're like, how on earth did you guys make it home? Planes would come back with holes in the wings and maybe the fuselage torn completely open. Engines barely running, missing sections, the hydraulics are shot. It's how was this plane in the air? And so engineers concluded, looking at many planes like this that had made it home, they looked at all these damaged sections and thought, well, how can we beef up these planes and reinforce them so that they're stronger? And so they were making plans for that, and this statistician came along and said, guys, like, you might be looking at this the wrong way. You're studying the planes that survived and endured. The places without bullet holes and damage are the places that actually really, really, really matter, because those are the planes, when planes got hit in those places, they didn't make it home. I think there's something helpful for us to learn there about faith. Faith doesn't endure because it avoids taking hits. I mean, you look at the lives of these men, and they are shot through with holes. Faith endures because God protects what is vital. These men were battered by life, but at the core, trust in God's promises remained unchanged. And that preserved to the end. And so when we look at Genesis, or these verses 20 to 22 of Hebrews 11, it's almost like God is saying, okay, I could tell you all kinds of dramatic stories in these men's lives, but I want to take you to their deathbeds. The beds on which these men died, and I want you to listen to them talk after all that they went through. And so starting with Isaac, from him, we're reminded that faith remains confident to the end. In verse 20, if you look there, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. When these men were invoking blessings on their children, those blessings were tied back to the promises that God made to Abraham. God said to Abraham, I'm going to bless you and your descendants, and through your line, all the nations of the earth. God had promised blessing to Abraham, and these men just keep kind of projecting those promises forward and out to their sons. Faith remains confident in God's promises to the end. When Isaac invokes future blessings on Jacob and Esau, he's about to die, and frankly, he has like a major senior moment. He gets his sons confused, right? I mean, he's got his sons right in front of him, and he doesn't know which one's which. One comes in and he thinks it's the other. The other one comes in and he thinks it was the brother that was just there. I mean, this guy is old and blind and decrepit. And even though this man is as blind as a bat, we might say, he's a man who can see. He can see the promises of God as if they were right in front of him. These promises are still here and they're real. He's weak and feeble and dying. And from verse 21, we're reminded that faith remains worshipful all the way to the end. Look at verse 21. We see the same story playing out, but with some additional details. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and catch this next phrase, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. So now Jacob's blessing his grandsons, but we read he's doing this. He's all the way at the end of his life, and he's bowing in worship. He's still worshiping at the end. Is that what you're going to be doing? Worshiping till your final breath? Or will the crucible break you? God puts you in a crucible, he turns up the heat, and that's just where you break and you're done. Or you get mad at God and you get angry and you turn your back on him, or you become bitter and sour. I mean, think about Jacob. This is a man that could have been so bitter. He could have had his finger pointed in the face of God and say, God, all those years that I worked for Laban, you robbed me. You took all those years away from my life. You gave me this father-in-law, and I worked for 7 years to marry this one girl, and then another 7 years after that. God, why did you do that to me? Then his wife dies young. God, you took my wife. It's not fair. Then Joseph, God, you took my favorite son. Or he could get to the end of his life and say, God, why did you take, now, okay, he's still alive. You took all those decades of years that I could have spent with Joseph. You just took those from me? Are you going to go to your grave grumpy and bitter and mad at God? We see here, faith does not do that. Faith worships all the way to the grave after all the hits, all the bullet holes. Faith is still worshiping. Jacob worshiped while dying. I think this is a helpful reminder for us that worship is a lifelong discipline, and it is a choice. It's not a mood or a feeling. It's not contingent on what a day holds. It's contingent on the fact that God is always the same. And then from Joseph, we learn that faith remains focused to the end. Look at verse 22. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Joseph at this point in the story has done quite well for himself. He's basically the second most powerful man in all the world, despite how rough it was for all those years before. But if we were to ask ourselves, okay, look at Joseph. You see this man who's been through all this pain, and now he's the second most prominent man in all the world. And we were to look at Joseph, look at this man and answer this question, where is his heart? Well, it seems quite clear that his heart is not in Egypt. His heart is not all the wealth of Egypt. It's not in his big position. Here's a man, he's at his on his deathbed, and he's speaking about Canaan. That's where his heart is. And he's focused on the promises of God. As we saw back up in previous verses, he's a stranger in exile on earth. He knows Egypt's not his home. Joseph remembered God's promises to Abraham, which leads him to conclude. He's thinking about the promises that God made to Abraham about the family and the blessing and the land. And he concludes that his family's not going to stay there in Egypt. If God made all those promises, his family cannot stay there in Egypt. And so he concludes that God is going to come visit the Israelites. And God is somehow, some way going to lead this entire family out of Egypt to the land of Canaan, to the promised land. And that's what his mind is on when he's dying, and he wants his bones to go too. Joseph could have been super distracted throughout his life. He could have been distracted by the pain or by the prosperity. Pain and prosperity, he knew them both well. But yet he's quite focused on the promises of God. What about you? Have you lost your focus? Has the world captured all your affection and attention, and it would be hard for you to say that you're a stranger and you're in exile here somehow? You're just quite at home. Has your pain or prosperity turned your heart away from the promises of God? This text is inviting you to put all the pain, all the prosperity in its place. The promises of God are bigger than all of that. You're probably familiar with the name John Bunyan. He spent 12 years in prison for preaching the gospel, and what was super ironic about John Bunyan is he could have walked out any day at any time that he wanted to, if he would just promise to stop preaching. You can walk out of here, John. You just got to promise you're not going to go out there and do what you were doing. But he wouldn't do it. And so, separated from his family, including a blind daughter, John Bunyan endured year after year after year in that prison, no seeming visible payoff. And yet in that crucible that he was in of just waiting and suffering, his faith endured. He kept his eyes on Jesus. And from that prison came the well-known book, Pilgrim's Progress, that I'm guessing many of you have read. It's one of the most influential Christian books ever written. We just have another reminder from another person that faith isn't always tested in a moment. Sure, there may be all kinds of really intense crisis moments, but it's often tested over long, long periods of time. And real faith lasts. If your faith is real, it should stand the test of time. Just a little, I think, interesting side note here that's pretty cool. We just saw in these last verses, you see faith being passed on from one generation to the next to the next. Not perfectly by any means, but truly. In fact, if you look kind of down through the family tree, so to speak, I mean, you'll see faith being passed on, and you'll see people that are essentially walking away from the Lord or never walked with him. But you do see faith truly being passed on through the generations of Abraham's family. Not perfectly, but truly. And I would imagine that you want God to do that in your family. And for as messed up as this family was in particular, I mean, just think through what you read in the book of Genesis. You read about one seriously messed up family. And for as messed up as they are, you can't help but get the idea that the parents, starting with Abraham and moving down through the generations, the parents and grandparents keep talking about the promises of God. About God and his word and what he had said and what he had promised to them. And that they truly believed those promises. They would have been talking about what we would call the gospel, but they were talking about it in Old Testament form. Because God had promised blessing to all the nations through Abraham's line. God had made these huge promises, and where were those promises fulfilled? Well, at the heart of those promises would be a son that would flow all the way through this line in Genesis, and you come to the end of the Old Testament, and this special person is born. And it's Jesus Christ, the one who would provide redemption and cleansing and forgiveness. They all died not seeing that, but they believed it. And you and I sit here today, we've gathered and we're celebrating Christmas, knowing that Jesus Christ has come. True faith is unbreakable and indestructible. And if yours is real, you say, I'm a Christian, I put my faith in Jesus. Well, if your faith is real, then no matter what comes, it may waver and it may get hit and it may take punches and blows, but it should stand through testing. Abraham, in his case, he believed that God would raise his son, or could do that. We believe because God did raise his son. We look back and say, well, Jesus came, and he's alive now. He died and he's risen from the grave. And that's why faith can endure in the crucible, because of Jesus Christ, because of God's promises. Is your faith in Christ? We're celebrating Christmas this week. Are you personally celebrating the fulfillment of God's promise in sending his son? Is your trust in Jesus? Have you cried out and said, Jesus, I need the saving that comes through Jesus. I need his forgiveness and cleansing from sin. I'm trusting in his resurrection. And that's certainly, if that's not the case for you, that's what God wants for you. That this Christmas you would say, God, I'm a great, great sinner. And I need you to cleanse me through Jesus and bless me through Jesus as you promised all the way back to Abraham. I want that blessing. Would you wash me of my sins? And by faith, I'm trusting in Jesus. Here's my life, and I want to live it by faith too. Maybe you sit here today and you're in the crucible moment, the heat's turned up, and you feel like you're riddled with holes, and you're kind of floundering around. And God wants you to look back at his promises. God, you said this. You promised this. And you're giving me these commands, but I'm going to fix my eyes on Jesus, and I'm going to keep going. God, help me. True faith is unbreakable and indestructible. Would you bow?